Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture by Friederike Welter.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure actually to see so many faces. I mean, it's a Saturday morning, it's 9 o'clock. Some of you actually might have partied yesterday. So let's hope that you'll stay away during the lecture. If I notice people falling asleep, I might actually change my topic and then start asking you instead of giving a lecture. Contextualizing entrepreneurship challenges and way forwards. That's my topic. Some of you might have thought, what is this about, contextualizing entrepreneurship? Basically, looking back into the research I have done in the past nearly 15, 17 years, I realized that I have done research in many, many contexts. Country contexts, regional contexts, different spatial contexts, different cultural contexts. And somehow this has become a topic which runs through my research themes and which runs through my interest as well. So over the past years I've become interested in how can we actually use these diversity and heterogeneity of contexts to push entrepreneurship research forward a bit. And that is what I'm going to talk about in the next 25 minutes. I would like to leave some minutes for questions and comments. Three key issues. The first one, why should we contextualize entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship research? The second issue, I will talk a bit about some examples of context. I could have built the whole lecture around examples of context, but I think we have to do some of the my background thinking as well. And my third issue actually is how can we incorporate context into entrepreneurship research. I've identified three major challenges which I would like to share with you, and also some ideas on how we can actually work forward. Why contextualize entrepreneurship? For those of you who are academically inclined, I actually browsed the literature and picked up three major quotations why we should contextualize entrepreneurship. One is because we actually take too many contexts for granted, so there are many more contexts we could do research on, we could actually take into account. The second quotation from Bill Gardner actually shows that we tend to underestimate the influence of the context. We actually focus, when we talk about entrepreneurship, we focus on the person. We focus on the individual characteristics, we focus on the experiences and the background, we underestimate that the context might actually have an influence on that as well. And the third one is Sheikh Zara, who talks about that if we contextualize our research, we effectively need to link theory and research objectives and science. But there are also personal stories why I think contextualizing entrepreneurship is quite important. Let me take you back to the mid-90s when I did one of my first research projects in Central and Eastern Europe. That was a project on small manufacturing companies in Belarus, Ukraine and Moldova. We actually wanted to know what makes them work. So how do they survive in an, at that time, quite hostile environment? How do they adapt there? What are their strategies? How do they grow the business? And during the survey, we discovered something which was quite interesting. We discovered that these very, very small manufacturing companies, and you must imagine most of them didn't have more than 50 employees. They actually had many sideline businesses or activities. They could have had either 2 or 3 businesses on the side or simply trading activities, service activities, selling activities. In management theory, that's called diversification. When I looked back into how can we explain this, of course diversification, and all of you are familiar with that, is a way to spread risk. That is how we explain that to our students. It's also a way actually to look at how you can develop a company. That works for mature market economies, but for these emerging market economies, we actually found out that the explanation is slightly different. It might be a way to spread risk, but they had very unrelated activities they were working on in their sidelines, and we found out that it actually was a financing strategy. The banking systems in these countries at that time didn't work properly. They didn't hand out credits to small businesses, to new businesses, to entrepreneurs starting a business. So what happened is that these small manufacturing companies, of course, they also had no savings, because during Soviet time you couldn't accumulate savings. Yeah? What happened is they simply diversified into sideline activities where they knew that they could generate working capital to overcome slack times when they couldn't actually sell their manufacturing products. So that's one of the stories why contextualizing entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship research actually is so important, because we wouldn't have understood that if we simply had relied on theories and concepts, management concepts tested in a non-emerging market economy context. Which contexts? There are different ways of actually categorizing contexts. We could look at physical, economical, social, cultural, historical, time. Physical, for example, physical, economical, where do you actually want to locate the business? Cultural, has the cultural influence on whether it is opportune that you start a business. So we talk about entrepreneurial cultures. I know both Sweden and my original home country, Germany, are supposed to be not very entrepreneurial cultures, while some of the emerging market economies actually differ a lot in that. Historical and time. Those are contexts which haven't found much consideration over the past years. It's coming a bit now, but it's quite interesting. Historical, actually looking at what does history tell us about how does the environment develop today, and what is the impact of that on entrepreneurship, on enterprise development. Yeah? And time, does it change? The second categorization is actually something I've been working on together with Candy Brush and Andrew Green. We're talking about that we have micro, meso, and macro level of context. The macro level would be more like the national, society, economy, country, global context, international context, and then you can actually go down here. The meso level would be intermediate institutions supporting enterprises, yeah? Or intermediate institutions like banks, for example, the banking system I was talking about, are directly supporting enterprises. And then the micro context would be, on the one hand, team management, and on the other hand, the individual, the entrepreneur, organization, firm. And you might be a bit surprised to see in the middle of this, the family and the household. That is because our thinking, and I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, our thinking goes in that way that family and household embeddedness actually is quite important in particular contexts or for particular groups to consider to adequately explain entrepreneurship. The third category, how to categorize context, would be to see context either as a variable or to see context as a lens we use to study entrepreneurship. What do I mean here? Context as a variable, that is basically what most of the current entrepreneurship does. So they simply use a context variable or maybe 2 or 3 context variables, and what they do with that very often, what I found out during a literature review, they control context away. So they do not really take it into account. What I'm arguing for is that we actually should use the category context as a lens. What that is, it's a more holistic and more encompassing perspective onto context. It also makes it more difficult. Will be one of my challenges later on. We could certainly discuss, and I appreciate any ideas you have there as well. Because if we go for a lens perspective, we will have a very difficult way of actually looking at entrepreneurship. We will have a more comprehensive way. Yeah? Which context? I brought some examples of contexts. Actually, I have 2 examples. One has to do with what Candy touched upon her in her lecture yesterday as well, the concept of family embeddedness. If you remember the circle, that would be more of a micro context. Yeah? And enterprising families. The example I brought here, and that is just one example from a project on cross-border entrepreneurship, actually we coined a concept there, or the term enterprising families. Now you might say, okay, we have the term family business. No, this is totally different. Because a family business is normally a business owned by a family or where the family actually plays a major role. Here we're talking about very sometimes very marginal entrepreneurial activities. But we also know that from these marginal activities, something more substantial develops over time. So let me run you through the example, because what you can see here is how family embeddedness not only influenced the activity as such, but it influenced the opportunity recognition. It influenced actually the way this entrepreneur was working and developing. She's a 65-year-old woman. She lives in Belarus, which is a very, very difficult environment for entrepreneurship anyway. And because she's a pensioner, she got this visa to easily visit relatives. Her relative, her sister, is married in Lithuania. And as a pensioner, you actually get the visa regulations are facilitated. She discovered, because she had to take medicines and she is a bit heartsick, she discovered that the medicines in Belarus, of course, are cheaper, slightly better than in Lithuania. And her sister, once she discovered that she brought over the medicines each time, they thought, okay, we can make a business out of that. Yeah? And selling the medicines to Lithuanian pensioners who don't have that much money. That's the way it evolved. But it got another story in there as well. The daughter works in a chemicals firm in Belarus. So the daughter had access to medicines. She could regularly buy larger quantities and actually sold them to the mother, and the mother took them over to Lithuania. The sister is married in Lithuania. She has actually built up a sales network there, selling the medicine to pensioners. And a second sideline business developed here as well. Over time, they discovered that they could buy cheap second-hand clothes and shoes in Lithuania, bring that back to Belarus, and sell it on the market there. So the niece and her girlfriend in Lithuania actually helped to secure these goods, and the pensioner takes them across the border and actually sells them in Belarus. That is one example of family embeddedness. Another example, contexts are not only something good or something bad. So it's not black or white, but it's rather a gray zone. Context could be both a liability and an asset for entrepreneurial activities. And the example here is from Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is one of the former Soviet republics. So that means they actually had a policy over several decades of fostering gender equality, because the Soviet Union had this kind of policy. Once the transition started, actually Uzbekistan as such, especially in the rural areas, is a very traditional society. So once the transition towards a market economy started, what happened is that the traditions kicked in again. Young girls could go to school, let's say, for 6 years, then they had to stay at home. Probably they were able to learn some vocational craft, but this was the only possibility, especially in rural areas, open for them. So this young woman, she had to take up something. She was the eldest in a family of 3 sisters. The father died unexpectedly. The mother couldn't provide any income to the family, so she had to take up a profession, a job, once the father died, simply to provide the family income. What did she do? Gold embroidery and sewing. Because of course that is something she could train in, and that is something which is very important, which could be operated from home. So she could actually set up a home-based business. What you see here is the cultural context kicking in. Yeah? And specifically, this is way different in large cities in Uzbekistan, in the capital like Tashkent or in Samarkand. So this is the cultural and spatial context as well we have here kicking in. But in that, the context was a liability, because she only could start this home-based activity. What happened over time, that first of all, she got her sisters interested in that. She actually kind of pushed them into taking up their own craft business, developing their own craft business. And she developed that much confidence over time because of her home-based business activities that she was able to open a sewing school where she started training neighborhood girls. And this is why I say context could be an asset as well. It was a liability in the first instance. Over time, context actually developed in being an asset. What happened here is that I think she broke out of the rules of the place and her culture. And over time, that actually might help this rural communities develop in another way, and probably see the role of women in another way as well. If we look at what's going on in entrepreneurship research at the moment, and what's behind this slide is an extensive literature review. I won't bore you with the details there, but what we actually know is that currently, when we look at how context is studied, it's a very, very restricted understanding of context. The most studied contexts are industry, markets, money. How do you get the financial resources to start a business, develop a business? It's management. How do you manage a young firm, a new firm? How do you manage a growing firm? And of course, it's social networks. So that is a very restricted context perspective if you think back of the circle where I showed you the different contexts entrepreneurship takes place. Another issue is that mostly we assume a one-way relationship. So basically we say the business context, the regulations impact on entrepreneurs, yeah, with respect to the liability thinking. But we do not take into account that, of course, entrepreneurs can also influence their contexts. They can change their context, even if that happens in very small steps, and even if that takes a long time. And the third issue is that most research is not multi-level oriented. So it's either the micro context, or it's the meso context, or it's the macro context. While my context lens perspective is arguing for a more holistic view. That brings me to my challenges. I have actually identified 3 major areas where we have to deal with challenges if we want to contextualize entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship research. One is, and this is probably where it gets very, very academic, challenges for entrepreneurship theory. Because what we need to do now is actually rethink our theories. We need theories and context. So it's not simply about, okay, I've done research in Belarus, I've done research in Uzbekistan. If I want to publish a paper or a PhD out of that, I simply do a small chapter and say that's the background context, the cultural, economic context in Uzbekistan, that is it in Belarus. But there is more behind that. We actually need theories which acknowledge that we not only have top-down effects, so the context impacting on the entrepreneur, but we have bottom-up effects, the entrepreneur impacting on the context. We have a very diverse understanding of context, and we have heterogeneity. What could those theories be? Candy, Anne, and I have been working with embeddedness concepts because those actually allow us to consider different levels of embeddedness, especially when it comes to acknowledging bottom-up effects. There is the concept of emergence, which might help us here as well. But we have a question where I have no answer to at the moment. Do we want one theory, which covers everything, which we can actually generalize across contexts? So far, we've thought that we actually had one theory we could use from mature market economies, because most of the management research has been developed in mature market economies and applied to emerging market economies or developing economies. Or do we actually aim for customized theory? You see the difficulty there might make it a bit more difficult because then you would have theories by context. Not theories by country context, but maybe theories where you say, okay, now I look at the macro context, now I look at the micro context. The second area of challenges is empirical research. Because if we really want to apply my context lens, we would need to sample across multiple sectors, domains, and spaces, as Steyer and Katz said in their introduction to a special issue where they looked at different contexts. The challenges we have here, which unit of analysis do we have then? Mostly, if you look at entrepreneurship research, it's either the individual or the firm, yeah? Or you look at teams within a company. We looked also in our projects at individuals or companies, and then discovered this doesn't fit what we've actually seen there. So in another project, we specifically brought in a kind of household perspective and tried to look at the household in relation to entrepreneurial activities. Makes it a bit more difficult. Which units of analysis do we really use here? The second issue is which methods, which methodology. And what I found particularly useful is kind of a method mix. So basically that you use large-scale surveys, for example, to get an understanding of the phenomenon as such, and then go down the road of using in-depth interviews, case studies, observations, and whatsoever to get a very, very deep understanding of the processes behind them. But of course now, you might say, if I think of that in terms of a doctoral thesis, I might never finish my doctoral thesis now because it's way too expensive as well. And the third issue is, I haven't talked about time as context. I touched upon it when I told you about the changes in the Uzbek society after the Soviet Union fell apart. But of course that is very important to take into account as well. Most research we do is retrospective. So we look at something today and we try to explain what's happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So we probably need more longitudinal research. Again, the problem here is financing, and actually you probably wouldn't have to argue with most foundations that they really finance longitudinal research. The third issue is challenges in contextualizing entrepreneurship research. What I'm talking about here, our research actually takes place in very many specific contexts and communities. I'm both a business administration and economics person, yeah? And we have the disciplines. So we have geographers working on entrepreneurship, we have economists working on entrepreneurship, historians, sociologists, and it's very, very seldom that we all sit together and talk at the same conference, but I think that is actually something which is needed. And another issue which I found out when I started doing research in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asian countries, we bring our own cultural context to the research side. And that makes it sometimes very interesting because of course I had my concepts in mind, how to explain certain phenomena. But then discussing with colleagues from Ukraine, from Uzbekistan, from Estonia, I really had to question these concepts. Do they work in that country? Isn't there another explanation which is actually coming out of history or coming out of the way they have dealt with things so far? And I think that is something we sometimes take for granted, that we actually know how it works somewhere else. I've learned a lot by doing research in totally different countries. So what I think, if we want to contextualize entrepreneurship research, it's really about listening to other disciplines, actually talking to other disciplines, and also probably recognize contributions outside the mainstream entrepreneurship debate. So going back to my initial question, why should we contextualize entrepreneurship? Context is important because it helps us to better understand the when, how, why, and who of entrepreneurship, and also the boundaries, and how you can push the boundaries of entrepreneurial behavior. And I also think that if we actually do context-sensitive research, that we can advance entrepreneurship theory and our understanding of how to teach entrepreneurship. But I'm not going to talk about that. That will be the next lecture then by Leona. Thank you very much for your attention, and we do have some time for questions and comments.
Listening to you, I'm just reading Van de Ven at the moment, and a lot of the stuff you're saying, he says almost exactly the same thing in the context of interactive research, like about context, towards mixing methods.
Yeah.
Does context sort of embedded research or context-oriented research, sort of, does it lean towards participated research at all, or
say the last one, does it lean to?
Does it lean towards sort of interactive research or participatory research or something?
Yeah, I'm a bit hesitating. I mean, most of the research projects I participated in, we had a kind of interactive perspective by presenting our results to policymakers, either throughout the project, so we had workshops with policymakers throughout the project and then at the end. But I don't think this was really participant research in the way that we interacted with the individuals or the companies. Hold on. One example though, the Belarusian partner on this cross-border project, they had very many difficulties in identifying individuals who crossed the border and actually did these trading activities because that was all semi-legal. So what one of the team did, the leader of the team, Anton, what he actually did is he boarded a train and went across the border himself. And sometimes he was also asked, that brings us to ethical questions of doing research. Sometimes he was asked to carry some of the goods across because of then they could carry a larger amount of goods across the border. Yeah? So that was a kind of interaction with the respondents.
Well, sort of related to that question, in one of the slides it says listen to each other.
Yes.
And I'm sort of interested, is it listening to the one you're researching or listening to other researchers? I've felt the same notion that co-production of knowledge is a key issue these days.
Yeah.
And in a way, it seems like you're actually opening up for that kind of research. So I'm quite excited about the way you are talking about doing research on entrepreneurship. I expected you to be on the macro level. But you seem to mix micro and macro in an interesting way. So co-production of knowledge, is that what you are looking at actually?
Yes, because when I tried to explain what we've seen in the Central and Eastern European countries, I actually browsed, let's say, for example, literature from anthropology, from ethnology, from sociology. It would have been fun and very important to have people from that discipline on the project as well. Yeah? So that is, in a way, co-production of knowledge, and I think there's way more out there we're actually not drawing on, because mainly and we are considering very mainstream debates, high growth enterprise, technology-oriented enterprises. Thanks.
Well, you said that mainly context is something influencing those pursuing entrepreneurship. But sometimes entrepreneurial activity can influence context. First, I would argue that in some contexts, you could argue that the context is co-created by internal and external factors, like industrial districts, for example. It's created from below.
Yeah.
But I would like you leaving this idea that they can successively influence. What about institutional entrepreneurship? That's a growing field. Will that be more dramatic changes of context taken by on initiative by entrepreneurs?
Yeah, well, I have a bit of a problem with the concept of institutional entrepreneurship because I've read up on that and I'm not sure it's a very coherent and consistent concept at the moment. But the notion behind that is that entrepreneurs are change agents. And I think we have different levels where they actually could change. So we have something like this big young woman who will make changes in very, very small steps. And you might actually only see that a generation after she had already left the business. Yeah? And you might have, what you are probably thinking about is more like political entrepreneurs, so entrepreneurs lobbying for changes in laws and business regulations, something like that. That would be changes on a larger scale. Yeah. But I'm hesitating to call that institutional entrepreneurship. I like change agents way better.
Yeah, but I mean, that's certainly an increasing field of research.
I know, I know.
This millennium on institutional entrepreneurship. So.
I know. Yeah.
We do have many authorities working with innovativeness and innovative networks and supporting innovativeness among small industries and things like that. Sometimes it's called and so forth. So lots of tax money involved into that in order to support growth. And I was thinking this interesting approach that you're arguing for in terms of research. What kind of political implications would that render?
Yes.
Because I foresee, of course, you can say, well, you can speculate about it.
Yes.
Because it might be quite different from what we see today.
Yes, exactly, and that is what I said, recognizing contributions outside the mainstream debate, because that is focused on growth-oriented enterprises and picking the winners. All policymakers are interested in picking those who contribute most in terms of employment and innovation. You might argue that what I've shown you is not really entrepreneurship. Let's say the cross-border activities, of course, that has a very large arbitrage element. She's making use of price differentials. Yeah. But what I haven't shown you in this presentation, we have seen when we actually look at enterprises who are involved and which are involved in this cross-border trade, what we've seen is many of them progressing from these semi-legal activities towards building up an enterprise in an environment where you can't simply go to a bank and say, I want a credit to build up my enterprise. So there is development potential in these activities, and by only recognizing growth-oriented business, or technology-oriented, or innovation-oriented businesses, we actually neglect that we should look more carefully at this development potential. But we had, at the end of this project, we had a workshop with policymakers both in Vitebsk, which is at the Belarusian border, and again then in Kiev. And policymakers are very, very difficult to persuade that they can actually do something by, they shouldn't foster these entrepreneurial activities, but they should actually look at the border crossing regulations. Yeah? Because what we did the project before Poland joined the European Union, and after that the visa regulations were way more restrictive. No more questions? Thank you.